Chapter 17. It was a Saturday in the middle of December. Each window framed a white landscape. The birches hung with snow faded into the white sky, and the white stretch of lawns was smudged only by the occasional ink blot of a crow. Inside the house was as quiet as the snow. Aunt Harriet and Aunt Lillian had gone out earlier, their dark figures becoming smaller and smaller on the white driveway, and the house had held a mysterious stillness all morning, holding its breath almost, as if waiting for something to fall. Maggie wandered aimlessly up and down the upstairs hall, opening and closing doors as though they were flaps on an advent calendar. Finally, she retreated into her own room and summoned the backwoods girls to the window. "Ooh, what are those?" they cried, crowding around the snow scene. "All those white things flying around. Those are snowflakes, dummies. Have you ever seen snow before?" "Ooh, snow, how wonderful. Open the window so we can see more." Maggie cranked the window open and stepped aside. "Ooh," they all cried. Catch them, bring them in here. Give me some, gimme. "You can't catch them," Maggie explained. "Look what happens when you touch them, see? They disappear. I can make them all disappear if I want to, just by touching them. Look, I'm magic. I can make snowflakes die with the tip of my little finger. Watch." "Ooh, don't kill them. Look, Maggie's killing the snowflakes." Dummies. They're just water, cold, white water in little shapes. She wasn't quite sure herself just what snowflakes were. Crystals, she had learned once, but crystals were those heavy glass ornaments that hung in a fringe of perfect cones around the chandelier, not these wet, shapeless rags that floated against her window, vanishing as they hit. "They're white water," she said. Little wet specks were blowing against her face, and she closed the window, but she remained on the window seat, gazing out, looking for something new to show the backwoods girls, and feeling the inside silence press on her as though it, too, were a blanket of snow. Suddenly her room rang with a cry, "Maggie!" and again, "Maggie, come!" and her hand flew to her throat. The sound hung in the air, and her room, paralyzed with silence just a moment earlier, became alive. The curtain trembled in some unfelt breeze, and the floorboard sprang beneath her step as she jumped up from the window seat. "Maggie, it's time." There was a long pause. What was she supposed to do? Answer them? She looked around. Answer who? Where? Finally, she stepped forward a little and replied as she did in school when her name was called in the morning. "Maggie Turner?" "Here," she whispered. "Present." And then a little louder, "Here," but no one answered. And she put a strand of hair in her mouth, feeling silly, talking to the air in her room. "Maggie!" Carefully she opened the door and peered into the hall. The walls were dark and quiet. "Come, we're waiting. You know where." And she did. Suddenly she knew exactly where to go and which door to open, and she sped down the dark hall. "I'm coming," she shouted as she ran. The first door, the one that led to the short flight of stairs, was unlatched, but the knob to the schoolroom door turned uselessly in her hands. It was locked, as if it had been for weeks. "Wait," she shouted, and her voice rushed down the empty hall like a cold wind. In a moment, she was in Aunt Harriet's room, sweeping through the jumble of pink curlers in the dresser drawer until she found the ring of keys. "Wait, I'm coming," and she ran back along the hall with the keys pressing their rows of baby teeth into her palm. "Just a minute," she whispered. As she pushed one key after another into the lock, her heart raced. Soon the door would open, and she would find two strangers waiting for her with their kettle and tea set, and a dog and broom and everything else that she had somehow come to know over the past weeks. "Here I am," she would say, and they would look at her pleased. "How nice you are," they would answer, and then maybe they would kiss her. "Wait, here it is," she said. A key turned, a hidden spring gave way, the door yielded, and she looked into a room that had no one in it at all. The schoolroom desks were just as she had left them. The globe lay round as a pumpkin in its wooden stand, and the blackboard still bore the imprint of the name she had written with her wet finger. Where were the strangers? Why weren't they there? The tea will cool. No, not the schoolroom after all. The empty room beyond. She crossed the door in the far wall, and next she was standing in the center of the varnished floor of the room with no furnishings. But no one was here either. Everything was still. Each uncertain window held a silent storm of snow, but nothing stirred within, and she let out a long sigh. It was all a trick. She looked around and finally walked over to the closet. With a quick jerk, she swept the door open, but she knew that it too would be empty. Everything was a trick. What's keeping her? The voice was in the closet. She could feel it in the walls, and she stepped back to see over the high shelf. Who's there? She whispered, entering again. How do I look? Lovely, just right. We want to look our best. Maggie? She ran her hands up and down the closet walls, the wall to the left, the rear wall, the wall hidden in the darkness to the right, when suddenly she came upon something she hadn't seen. A knob. No, not a knob. Knobs were round. This was more like a handle, a latch, the kind that lifted up and down on the screen door. Very slowly, trying to make no noise at all, she lifted it up and gave a small tug. From somewhere, there came the sound of a gentle crack, and she pulled again. This time something, a portion of the wall, it seemed, began to yield, and with the next tug, it opened like a door on a hinge. A sudden rush of cold air hit her face, and soon she began to make out the outline of a stairway, dark, worn, and with puffs of dust in the corners of each step. She gazed into its reaches and put out her hand to the wall. It was cold, and her fingers held the smell of its dampness. No sound came. Who's there? She wanted to ask, but the words lay silent in her throat. Then, I am growing restless. Maybe we should wait in the garden. The roses will be soothing. But I want to be here when she comes. Maggie's heart pounded, and her ears with it. Very slowly she closed the door behind her. She was in darkness now, and she had to feel the bottom step with her toe. The stairs were steep and narrow, and she could make out nothing of what lay at their top. With her hands braced against the wall, she slowly mounted 2 feet to each stair, until a sweep of her foot told her she had reached the last step. There she stood still, her heel hooked over the edge. A cobweb broke against her arm, and her fingers, meeting a sudden object, a table, a box, sank into soft dust. At first she could see nothing at all, but then she began to make out the dimensions of an enormous space and the outlines of shapes, massive white shapes, some reaching the ceiling, others stretching along the floor. Giants, she thought, and she backed down a step. Giants in white gowns who had lured her there with the sound of their voices, and in the next instant she would rise from the floor and, I think she's coming. The voice came from some distance away. Maggie could now see that the giants were really pieces of furniture, cabinets maybe, and long tables, draped in cloth, and she took a step forward. Far to her left stood another huge piece, but not wrapped in cloth, the back of a wardrobe of some sort, and around its corner was a small window. If Maggie could get over there, she could lift its curtains and let the light in. It will be soon now. She spread herself against a wall and barely breathed. Who's there? She tried to whisper, but again no sound came from her lips. From the other side of the wardrobe, something stirred with a sharp crackle of a newspaper being hurriedly put down. Something, a chair leg maybe, scraped. The curtain trembled. Something else, a dish, fell and shattered, and a whispered cry of dismay rose. Mercy! Maggie stepped back toward the stairway. Now look, a teacup broken. If she doesn't hurry, I'll break something more. I always drop things when tea is late. The chair scraped again, and something with many parts moved. Maggie! She could still escape, edge down the stairs, slip through the closet, and return to the snowflakes at her window. There was still time. What's the trouble with the bread tin? The voice was deep. The voice was deep now, the man's. It doesn't open. Wrap it along the edge. It's stubborn and will need another teacup now that this one is broken. What can be keeping her? What shall we do with the broken pieces? Let her sweep them into the coal scuttle. And then for a long time there was silence. Nothing moved and no voice spoke. Slowly she pushed herself away from the wall, her hands spread out in front of her face as though she were making her way through the dense fog. Still no sound came, and she slid one foot in front of the other toward the window on the other side of the wardrobe. She could see a narrow strip of snowflakes edging the curtains like a fringe of dancing pom-poms, and the wardrobe was close enough for her to touch. She tapped softly against its wall, waiting for someone to call out from the other side, "Come in," but no one spoke. With just one gesture, she could touch the window or peer around the corner, but she stood still, waiting, the silence around her so strong it rang in her ears. Then she sucked in her breath. "Now," she said. And with a sudden plunge, she reached out to the curtain and swung it aside, letting in a rush of white at last. At the same moment, a familiar voice cried out, "At last," and Maggie stood in what she always called later on the other room.